Hello and welcome everybody. This will be the panel discussion on models, and we will begin shortly. I'm just going to let everybody to get access into the room first. So please just be patient. Give it one more minute and then we will get started. Okay, good afternoon or good evening, good morning, wherever you are. My name is Jessica Johnson. I'm the Education Program Coordinator with the Ecological Society of America. And today we're going to do a panel discussion on models. Today's moderator is going to be Rich Kliman of Cedar Crest College, and he will be introducing our great group of panelists. So at this time, I'm going to kick it over to Rich. It's all you, Rich.
Okay, hopefully I think I'm on, right? Great. Okay, yeah, so we have three panelists today. They're each gonna give a short presentation, and then we're gonna open this up for Q&A. So hopefully you're able to see the Q&A icon at the bottom where you can enter questions with the same sort of thing that we had earlier today, where if you see a question and you also have the same question, upvote it. That will move it up in the list. There's quite a number of participants actually in this group, which is great. So we're going to start with Drew Hasley. He helps run the Universal Design for Learning at BioQUEST. Drew?
Thanks a lot, Rich, and thanks everybody for giving some of your time. I know it's hard to choose. There's a lot of good stuff going on, so thanks for coming to this one. Yeah, so I want to explain really quickly. So BioQuest, for those who may not know, is a nonprofit that's in its 34th year that really dedicates itself to sort of transformative and improving undergraduate biology education. So that what that really looks like is that we do a lot of professional development with faculty at 2- and 4-year institutions. We have a pretty heavy focus on helping people incorporate more quantitative reasoning and model type things into their biology teaching. It seems to be an area where students and faculty alike can struggle. And the part of that I've been most involved with, it's a little bit more recent, we've been doing it for a few years now, is building universal design for learning into that. And I won't go too deep into it here. We'll talk about it a little bit more in the breakout. But the idea of universal design for learning is really to provide a framework and a set of guidelines and really help people adopt a mindset for how do I make my curriculum, my materials, whatever it may be, work for the broadest possible diversity of students along many axes of diversity. So what I'm actually specifically going to talk about today is a model for teaching a model. We started a little while back. Me, Kristen Jenkins, the director of BioQuest, and Phil Gibson at University of Oklahoma came into the project a little later, working on a way to teach phylogenetics that was more accessible than traditional methods. And the reason that we looked at phylogenetics, it's interesting. We've been talking about this 4D framework for the last couple of days, and it's really been useful for me to kind of drop back 5 steps and think, okay, what the heck does phylogenetics have to do with ecology? Because I know it does. I know it's important, but why? And for me, it made me think back to, boy, getting my head around phylogeny really helped me with a lot of natural history stuff, because it stopped being a memorization game at that point and started becoming more of a comparative, exploratory, I can bin these things a little bit, but not totally bin them because the bins are related. And learning about trees helped me do that. And then there's the flip side of it, which is trees are models, right? They are models of relationships as we understand them with our current data. Relationships between, pick your entity, whether it's between organisms, whether it's between populations. You can even do community phylogenomics. So it's a way to actually put those things together, but it's the best one we've got when we're talking about evolutionary relationships. But students really struggle with it, and we know they struggle with it. And what's been identified before is that one of the reasons that that's true is because there's a lot of nomenclature associated with it, and it's an abstract concept. So, right, this is a common thing with models. They have vocabulary and they're abstract a lot of the time. So one way to deal with this with phylogeny that we started from this was a publication by David Goldsmith back in 2003, an American biology teacher, called The Great Clade Race. And anybody who's taught phylogenetics may have actually run into it at some point or another. And without going too deep into it, it breaks the concept of trees down into just a logic puzzle, almost a game, and removes the biological and evolutionary baggage from it. And you know, we can talk about good and bad of doing that, but it gives students an intro to the concept. What is a node? What is a branch? What is a tip? Why does this matter? What can you learn from a tree, without having the extra things that could be confusing? But we came into that and we said, well, this activity is great, but we want to tie it to a biology. So colleagues of mine did that. And then we said, but it's still on paper and it's still all visual. This isn't very accessible. And for those who don't know, I'm a blind scientist. And we figured out ways to teach me trees in undergrad, but it was clunky. And so I said, well, let's work on ways to make this work. And it started with that narrow focus. Someone who struggles, whether it's vision or a cognitive disability, whatever it may be, with doing things drawn out on paper in 2 dimensions. Let's fix that. And what's really cool, and this is where UDL comes in, we ended up getting a lot of unanticipated benefits for every single one of the students who was participating. And we'll talk about what those are, and we'll talk about it as a process. So I'm going to be talking to you about a model for teaching the model of phylogenetic trees, but we're also going to take the opportunity to really talk about what is good about this thing that we have come up with, and how can we keep what's good about it when we have to try and do it online, because the activity itself, I'll tell you right now, in its current form, won't work online. It would be very difficult to do, and you'll see why. But how can we take things that worked well for all of those students, those benefits that we saw, and transition it to online and really think about what that looks like? And that's where the UDL framework comes back. So that's what we're going to be doing, and I hope it's of interest, and I will be quiet and go on to the next panelist.
That's great, Andrew. Thanks. So our next panelist is Tammy Long. She's an associate professor in the Department of Plant Biology at Michigan State.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me to attend today. I feel like I'm kind of standing in for my research collaborative team here today, so I want to give them a shout out first. So in our breakout session that follows this panel discussion, I'll be joined by Jenny Momsen, who's from North Dakota State University, and our additional colleagues who will not be joining us today, but are really important and influential in the material that we will be presenting and sharing with you. That includes Elena Bracebeth at St. Louis University and Sarah Wise at Bethel University. And the 4 of us have been working together for upwards of 10 years now. We first started working together on the development of a revised, transformed, whatever you want to call it, introductory biology course at Michigan State University. And as part of that development work that we were doing, we were trying to bring novel assessments and more authentic types of assessments and ways of teaching into the course that we were sharing at that time. And one of the things that we were really struck by was the diversity of ideas that students brought forth when they were assessed in the form of drawings and models, as opposed to text-based narrative responses. So we saw some really striking similarities in terms of the conceptual ideas that are elicited, but we also saw some really intriguing differences. And in particular, one of the things that was really striking to us is that we found that for big foundational concepts like evolution or the transformation and cycling of matter and energy, we saw that students tended to perform better when they were given the option to draw their responses as compared to when they were able to write their responses. So over those years, since we started innovating in that class, we've developed a fair bit of curriculum and materials that we have shared through publications. We've conducted research. And what we'll share this afternoon is some of our strategies and approaches for a very simple approach to modeling that we use in our classrooms to this day. Now, I know that Drew just mentioned that there are some really serious limitations from doing simple two-dimensional pen and paper drawings, but that's kind of where we started with this. And although our modeling approaches do lend themselves to computational approaches and using computers as a way to generate the visualizations, we also kind of purposefully kept it simple for teachers that have limited resources or are confronted with challenges of bringing computers into their classrooms, especially when we're teaching upwards of 200, maybe 400 students in a classroom. So we'll introduce some of those strategies and that approach this afternoon. The modeling approach and theory that we based all of our materials on derives from structure, behavior, function theory, which actually is from the engineering side of things. So the engineers have, an engineer by the name of Ashok Goel developed this theory to describe designed and engineered systems, particularly for their applications in artificial intelligence work. So we've adapted that framework. We've adapted the language and the approaches in order to provide a conducive and simple approach to modeling biological systems in our classrooms. So much of what we'll spend our time on this afternoon is breaking that apart, describing what SBF is, how it's used and represented. We'll show some examples of student models, and we'll share some of our simple tools and strategies for how we manage these in classrooms, including how we deliver feedback to very large classrooms. So that's about all that I really wanted to introduce about that. I'd be happy to take any questions after we hear from Paul.
All right, thanks, Tammy. And our third panelist is Paul Strode. He's a high school biology and science research teacher in Boulder, Colorado, with a specialty in ecology and evolution. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Tammy and Drew. I created a few slides to help illustrate what it is that I want to talk about and how I approach modeling in the classroom. I put the link to the slides in the chat, so you can pull them up yourself. But I'm going to go ahead and share them now. And so in trying for me personally to understand what models are, I think that this definition here from Winchell and Thompson is really good. So they say scientific models are representations of how some aspect of the world works. Scientists create models in the forms of analogies, conceptual drawings, diagrams, graphs, maps, physical constructions, and computer simulations as a means of describing and understanding the organization of systems, and then I added, and how they work, from cells to galaxies and natural processes, from evaporation to predator-prey relationships. And so, for example, what you're looking at here are 4 models that attempt to understand the relationship between the annual lion and leopard count in the Serengeti and the annual baboon count. So these 2, or actually 3 populations, the predators and the potential prey. And so the first model is just in 1 year, how do the populations relate to each other? And then the next in panel B is the annual baboon count 1 year later. And panel C is the annual baboon count 2 years later. And panel D is the annual baboon count 3 years later. And so the question here is, what is the best model for understanding the relationship between the two? And so we come up with a mathematical model, but then we also need to think about the plausible explanatory mechanistic models for this biological process. So of course, as biologists, we would then take the leap, not much of a leap actually, to then conclude that the lions and leopards are probably eating the baboons, and they're having an effect on them, maybe not in that 1 year, but maybe a couple, 3 years later. Another way that I use modeling in my classroom is to have my students create perfect, quote, perfect data representations. And so on the left is a data representation of an experiment where you're looking at goldenrod plants, and you've got your control plants, some that have galls and some that have been mechanically clipped, and the number of branches on each of those three treatments. And so in the first figure there is what you would expect perfectly if your result was inconsistent with your experimental hypothesis and consistent with the statistical null. On the right is the kind of the perfect data representation of what would be consistent with an experimental hypothesis and also consistent with the alternative statistical hypothesis. And so I like to have my students imagine what would the data look like if it was completely unsupportive of your experimental hypothesis, and what would the data look like if it was completely in support of your hypothesis. And then they get the results, and they figure out where they are in between these two possible perfect outcomes. Another way that I approach modeling is using contrasting cases. And so this comes with some, this is some work that I've been doing with the biological sciences curriculum study. And so here we have a graph of some percentage data of US Census race categories, Black and white individuals, and their representation in the country, in the NFL, and in STEM fields. And then we have these two imaginary students making claims about why the data look the way they do. And one student is on one end of the spectrum. Taylor is claiming that individuals of the same race differ from each other genetically, but people from different racial groups don't differ at all genetically. And then Robin is at the complete other end of the spectrum. Most genetic differences must be different between races. Genetic differences between individuals of the same race are too small to matter. And so we have these two contrasting cases that then the students wrestle with, and they look at additional data and try and figure out which of these students is more right than the other, because it turns out neither one of them is actually completely right. Something that Brian Donovan at BSCS reminds us of is the backfire effect. And when we're doing modeling, we need to be really careful that we're scaffolding learning to enhance the systematic processing of the new information students are getting. And so instead of presenting students with all the complexity of the scientific data, we have to figure out where that sweet spot is. And so for example, on the left are all the statistical data from Rosenberg 2011. And then we have how we might model it for students in a simple figure on the right with just some big circles and the circles slightly overlapping each other. Here, just another example of modeling with genetics. You know, a lot of students come into my class, maybe your classes as well, thinking that Mendel's simple model of gene to trait is the model, is the only model for how traits are expressed. And it works for some things, but it doesn't work for most things. And so we break that model and with data, with adding little bits of data for students, and then they end up building a much more complex model, but something that is much more representative of how things actually work. So then, you know, getting to what I'll be talking about in my session, Parks Collins, who teaches at Mitchell College on the East Coast, he and I have put together an activity for students that uses the HHMI biointeractive population dynamics model to explore this concept of R naught. And so this R naught is a pretty popular concept. It's developed using modeling. It's really complex. And so Parks and I attempted to create an activity that students could learn about R naught in a way that doesn't overwhelm them with the complexity of it, but also doesn't create misunderstandings. And one thing that we're going to ask you, if you come to our session, is are we doing a good job with it? For one, we've both tested it on our students, and then how might we scaffold it even better than we have? And finally, how might we bring in this idea of K, which is the dispersion of something like a virus, to be even more accurate in how we're modeling it? And so anyway, so we've got a resource that you can use in your classes, but we're currently working on it and developing it. And so that's it. That's my story. And there you go. That's how I approach modeling.
Thanks, Paul. Okay. At this point, there are 2 questions. There are 25 attendees, so hopefully we'll get a few more questions added to this. Again, remember there's the Q&A option down at the bottom. The question that's at the top is addressed to Tammy. You all may have some insights on this as well, but I'm going to start with Tammy. And so what Mark writes is totally agree on the power of students drawing answers. However, one of my challenges in the transition to teaching online has been the lack of ability to have students draw answers in online exams. And boy, I really sympathize with this myself. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, actually, I don't know the constraints of your particular system. We don't have Canvas. I've heard it's so much better than what we do have, which is D2L. But what we've done is we've designed questions within the online platform to enable students to upload a file. So students will draw a model on paper and take a picture of it with their camera and then simply upload it to the online system for that particular item on their exam. So that's been our workaround. It looks like someone also replied with basically the same strategy, file upload. So that's absolutely what we've been doing. And some of my colleagues that have slightly smaller classes than I do have also been playing around with some of the online tools like Jamboard and Zoom's whiteboard feature for collaborative drawings in class. We've run into a barrier with our group structure in D2L for my particular class, so we haven't been able to do that, but we do that in the classroom quite a bit, that we have students draw individual models and then share and exchange them with their peer groups, and then construct revised models based on the collaborative feedback that they get from their peers.
So this is Drew, and I obviously this isn't relevant specifically to Tammy's situation at all, but this is a common thing that I think a lot of folks are dealing with right now when they've done anything but traditional text representations, is how to do anything but a text representation online. And I'm wondering if, I think it'd be interesting to have a conversation potentially about why drawing, or think about why drawings work well, and we've got some evidence for that, and how you could get those same things with something else. So I'm thinking about, I would be just as happy to have someone describe to me their drawing process as they're actually going through it. And I feel like you could develop rubrics that would allow for either a drawing or a verbal description, or maybe even something else, and actually say, represent this to me somehow, pick away. And then have a rubric that can fit all of those. I don't know what my other 2 co-presenters think about that, but.
Well, we're going to try that, Drew. So this semester, for one of the assessments that's coming up, we're actually going to have the students use Flipgrid, which is another online tool, and we're going to give them the option of describing their responses orally. So I've never done this in class before. I have 200 students in the class, so it's a bit much, but we're going to also use this for research purposes. So it's going to fulfill a couple of functions, but we're going to let students try the description, as well as providing them a couple of visual models that they can give us oral feedback about. So I'll let you know in a while, but we have done clinical interview research where we've done things similar to this. So students come in for a research study and we ask them to construct a model and do a talk aloud while they're doing it. So we can get at some of those things that you were talking about before, the processes and the reasoning behind why they construct the drawing in the way that they do. So we're able to probe them for questions like, why did you start with that particular structure in your model? What made you think of that particular resource when you were drawing this image? Why did you make that connection? So we get a lot of data from the students from those clinical interviews. They're really, really insightful.
So Tammy, can I ask if so Andrew has a question that may relate to this. it seems technical to me, but I'm sure you know what he's asking, which
Okay.
is, I imagine you were going to talk about the structure, behavior, function theory, but it would be interesting to know a little more about the context in which it was developed. And it just moved, and why it is so useful for teaching and learning biology.
Okay. Yeah, so in the session, we will talk a little bit more about SBF. So that's the abbreviation for structure, behavior, function theory. As I mentioned very briefly, because I didn't want to dig too deep into it, I wasn't sure if people were interested or not right now. But it's a theory that originates from engineers who were involved in design systems. So what the theory is it's a way to deconstruct models of systems into simple constituent parts. So fundamentally, all models and models of systems are comprised of things that we would call structures, where structures are the objects in the system. So if we think about this in terms of giving advice to students about how to build one of these, those would be the nouns or the objects in a biological system. The B is for behaviors. So we actually don't use that term behavior in biology because engineers mean something different by behavior than what biologists do. So when we're using this language in biology, we change that term to relationships. Those relationships are the interactions between components in a system. So whether it's between a predator and a prey organism or between a microbe and its host, relationships tend to be verbs. They tend to be processes or mechanisms that explain how and why different components and systems are connected and what the nature of that relationship is. So then when you combine all of the structures, or AKA components in the system, plus their relationships, then what emerges from that is a function. The function is the output of the system or what the model is representing. So I tell my students to think about their model as a story that they're trying to tell. The story has actors, it has components, and those components are interacting with one another. And if I stand back and look at your model, I should be able to tell what it is that you're trying to tell me. What is the story that you're trying to convey? So the reason that we locked into that is we were looking for a way to deduce a common language and a simple way of explaining and describing a model for our students so that we could deploy this in class in a fairly systematic sort of way. One of the struggles that we encountered early when we started having students doing drawing is that the drawings were so variable and the students were coming at them from so many different directions that it's really difficult to make comparisons. And by adapting this common language, it allowed us to somewhat standardize the way that we were talking about a particular system and what kind of model it was that we were asking back from students. It's really important that the students understand there's not one right answer. There's not a single model that accurately represents the system. There's lots of ways to do it, but at least it reduced a little bit of that variation somewhat so that well, the variation was, in the realm of craziness to some extent. So we're trying to rein in a little bit of the crazy to get down to the core concept. So that it was very helpful for us in that way. And I'm going to apologize. We have a thunderstorm that's just rolling in right now. So if you're hearing banging and cracking in the background, that's the storm. It decided to just show up right now. So I'm going to mute.
I want to just add that Drew mentioned drawing and Tammy mentioned stories, and that just reminds me, and of course Andy Martin is here on the call, of something I learned from Andy several years ago is the idea of cartooning methods, and so he has his students think about or read about methods maybe in the methods of a paper, and then draw the methods, cartoon them out. And I've started having my students do that, and it's so helpful for them to model the methods of an experiment. And I even have them model the methods of their own personal experiments that they do. So draw out that model, tell the story of the data collection that you're planning. So just really good stuff. Shout out to Andy.
Thanks. Okay, so I have to go because a question, I've got the right place. So there was an anonymous question, and it's actually a really important one, I think, which is how much of your teaching involves using models? because it seems like you could use models for everything. And I think this is actually a really interesting question when we're talking about science education, considering how much time we often think about how much of our teaching is just sort of fact content kind of teaching, as opposed to sort of process and function. So Tammy has said, indeed. So who wants to take this?
I feel like I'm getting a disproportionate number of the questions, so I don't want to hog the time. So I'll make my response short, but I absolutely use models for everything. So we use it for organizing our instruction. We use it for framing the content so that students can understand how a particular concept that we're working on in class fits within the larger context. We absolutely use it for assessment, both formative assessment and on their exams. Students know they're going to be working with models on the exams. So they're going to use the SBF type models to construct their own models that show how they understand conceptual relationships. But we're also going to be using different kinds of models for things like genetics principles, for illustrating meiotic processes, we do phylogenetic trees, we do models for evolutionary relationships. We do quantitative models too for the population ecology. So I absolutely would attest that my class is very much model-based, as are the classrooms of my colleagues that work with me on the same project.
Do Paul or Drew, do you have anything to add to this?
This is Drew, and I guess the quick thing that I would say, so I'm not currently teaching, but I see, so I will confess personally, I don't do well with rote memorization. I can do it in a pinch, but it doesn't stick for longer than a couple months. And so for me, models are great because they're stories. Representation and vocabulary and all that we can get caught up in, but at the end of the day, a model is a story. And I think that there's evidence out there that storytelling is a good cognitive tool for doing sort of self-reflective learning. So I could see, I don't think you'd have to work too hard to shoehorn models into just about anything you're trying to teach.
Thanks.
Yeah,
go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's funny. It makes me remember or think about some of the answers I get on free response questions. Sometimes the students they might not have all the vocabulary, but they're retelling the story, and that's, I think that's great. They learned something. And you know, all of the complex terminology we use can come, and it's okay if it comes slowly, but just the fact that that they understand the stories and that they can conceptualize what's going on, I think is a win, definitely a win.
Hey, Rich.
Yep.
There's a hand raised in the participants list. Suzanne, do you want to ask your question? Oh, you lowered your hand. If you want to, I'll allow you to talk and you can ask your question. You're have the ability to unmute now, so you can talk if you want to ask.
Well, I guess so. I didn't want to take more time. I just, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I was realizing I'm typing something for Drew, and I realized that's not your best mode of communication. I should just ask. I keep thinking about, like, the cartoon idea was really great that Paul thought. I thought I could really visualize that. And I'm thinking again, I guess your answer would be allow a verbal description of the story or the problem. I'm trying to think inclusively, because I was going to go to a different session, but I wanted to go to yours too. That's why I asked, can I go to all of them?
I can say a couple of quick things. One is that another option, in addition to a verbal sort of response, some kind of auditory response, if there's a way that you can make, this is hard right now in remote, but in the world where we have some kind of face-to-face instruction and we're really thinking about how to leverage that to its best potential, anything I can manipulate is great. And other students like that too. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about in my session. So if anytime we could manipulate something in a class, I was excited because that's a natural mode for me, but you'd be surprised how much it helps people who are used to not being able to do that. That's not doable for everything. And so having an audible response is great too. But from the universal design perspective, that's a really good question to ask the students. How do you think we could have options for representing this content back? And that's scary for everybody, me included, to do. But actually getting involved, getting some feedback from students, what would be a way that would work for you guys, or what are ways? Let's generate a list of possible response types that would be comfortable for you to actually show me what you know, as opposed for me to figuring out what you don't know, right? That obviously has practical constraints and everything else, and those can be discussed, but you'd be amazed how many ideas they'll come up with, let alone just me.
That's great. Thank you.
And another question that came through, it was posed to Andrew, is if asking students to generate or analyzing a model, what are some of the key strategies to ensure UDL principles are incorporated?
This is Drew, and that's a big question that we could talk about for 2 hours. The problem and the blessing with trying to answer that question is that UDL as a concept and as a framework is completely discipline agnostic. But our discussion about models here isn't, right? There are particular models that work in that are common in our discipline and things like that. So generally speaking, with models, I don't know what the general principles would be. But when it comes to models in ecology, at least, or I could even just say in biology in general, I think the key thing to think about is how many ways are there to represent this model, both when I'm trying to show it to them and when I'm asking them to show it to me. Because when I'm trying to find good vocabulary for, and maybe this is it, separate the representation of the model, whichever direction it's going, from the model itself. The model itself is a set of concepts and their relationships and what happens at the end, like Tammy just gave us a beautiful explanation of, right? And there are myriad ways that we can try to represent that. So I guess the most generic answer I can give, and that might make it the least helpful, is if you can get into the mindset of this is how I would represent it, or this is how papers represent it, or how textbooks represent it, how many other ways could this be represented? By how many other different means? And where can I provide options to do that? That don't drive me to distraction because I have 200 students. Like that's the reality too.
So one question that I want to ask you is a general question about models. We've got a couple minutes left before we have to actually close down and then head off to the next breakout rooms. Is how do we address the value of models to students, knowing that they don't actually completely describe systems?
Is no one going to jump on this?
Well, that's such a great question. So I guess I tell my students, all models are wrong. At best, they are informative, and our job as scientists is to collect more data and improve the models so that they can do a better job at predicting phenomena. And so so I don't know if that aligns with any of anyone else's philosophies, but yeah, that's where my head is.
This is Drew, and I guess for me, the easiest way for me to answer that question is with an example. And so there's this question that I've sometimes struggled with myself and been asked by other people: why do we teach Hardy Weinberg? because it's a completely idealized situation that exists basically nowhere in any system ever. And the reason we have models, and not all models are quite like that, but the reason we have a model like that is because it's a system where we know all the rules because we set them. And by having something to compare with the real data we're getting, we can figure out where those rules are being broken, and that tells us something about the quote unquote real world system. So models give us a jumping off point, and I think that aligns with what Paul was saying.
So if I could jump onto that one, because when I teach, PopGen and ask if you have a new mutation that is beneficial, what's the chance that it rises to a high frequency in the population? 100%. And in a population that's infinite minus
You're breaking up, Rich. I think we're losing you.
models, that leads to a profound difference in the outcome.
Yeah, Rich, we missed a lot of it because I think that you broke up right when you were saying your statement.
Yeah, the only thing, so yeah, I saw that something went wrong. I was saying that if you're dealing with a finite population that's massive versus an infinite population, and you ask what's the chance that a new beneficial mutation rises to a high frequency, the two models give you very different answers. And then you have to think about, well, which of these applies, right? I think
But I just wanna-
shut down.
Well, this just we got one minute. I just want to reiterate what you just said, Rich. It's similar to this idea of students thinking about perfect data. What data would be, perfectly support the hypothesis, and what data would perfectly refute the hypothesis, and then where did their actual data fit in between? That's really what we're doing when we're thinking about how to come to conclusions with the data we collect.
So hopefully I can be heard, because I want to make sure that I can be heard to say thank you to the panelists. And I think we're going to be kicked out any second so that we can move on to the breakouts.
Yeah,
so thanks for doing this, and I guess we got it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Rich, we can hear you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, panelists. The breakout session is going to happen right after this. So the panelists are going to jump to their new Zoom link right away. And if you want to talk in more depth with either Paul, Tammy, or Drew, go find them in their link and have a great conversation. And thank you for joining us. Bye, everyone.